Is weed secretly making athletes better in ways sport refuses to admit? It's been called a performance enhancer and a recovery tool, but authorities see it as a threat to everything competition stands for. Athletes are still being punished for a substance that a number of scientists argue is a safer alternative to the opioids prescribed for decades. The debate has existed for years, but it exploded again in the last few seasons after one shocking incident dragged it back into the spotlight. Now it's forcing a deeper look at what's really going on behind the bans and the science around cannabis in elite sport. Back in 2021, Sha'Carri Richardson was a goddess on the track. She obliterated the 100-meter sprint at the U.S. track and fields trial for the Tokyo Olympics. It was a dream come true for any 21-year-old elite athlete, until she tested positive for marijuana use and was handed a life-altering 1-month suspension from the sport. Not only did this cost Sha'Carri the equivalent of $10 million in revenue, but also her shot at the Olympic gold medal. There are plenty of physical reasons an athlete might spark up or take an edible, but Sha'Carri's use of cannabis was entirely for emotional reasons. She'd been brought up by her grandmother and had a difficult relationship with her biological mother, who had died a week before the tryouts. Sha'Carri would later say that when a journalist ambushed her with this information during an interview, it sent her on an emotional spiral. Weed was her way of helping to emotionally regulate herself. In her official statement after her admission and acceptance of the official consequences, she said, "I apologize. As much as I'm disappointed, I know that when I step on the track, I represent not only myself, I represent a community that has shown great support, great love. I didn't know how to control or deal with my emotions during that time." Sha'Carri is just one of the latest people to have their promising athletic careers thrown off track because they dabbled in weed. Ross Rebagliati was the first ever gold medal winner for snowboarding at the 1998 Nagano Olympics in Japan. Then he had that medal stripped 3 days later when traces of cannabis were found in a urine sample. He was even jailed for a brief period in Japan. Thankfully, he was released and he had his medal given back because the International Olympic Committee hadn't specifically banned weed at the time. Cannabis was added to the banned substance list in 2004 when the World Anti-Doping Agency, or WADA, assumed responsibility for compiling the international prohibited list. It became known in the media as the Ross Rebagliati Rule. WADA's global code sets the tempo for rules around drugs in sport, and both US ADA and the United States Olympic and Paralympic Committee are signatories. The use of substances violates what WADA likes to refer to as the spirit of sport, the central pillar of all their anti-doping policy. What exactly is the spirit of sport? According to WADA, the celebration of the human spirit, body, and mind, and is reflected in ethics, fair play, and honesty, health, and respect for rules and laws. To preserve this spirit, weed is sharing the list with extreme performance enhancers like anabolic steroids and peptide growth hormones. But should it? Probably not, according to WADA's own research. In a bombshell 2018 review of the substances listed on WADA's prohibition rubric, researchers actually found that the evidence behind the idea of cannabinoids is incredibly weak, especially compared to other forms of doping on the list. In fact, the review goes so far as to say, quote, "Very few scientific data are available on the effects of cannabinoids on sports performance itself. This shows there is no evidence for performance enhancement of cannabinoids." Based on the research, you might genuinely get less conclusive performance enhancement from weed than you would from downing a large can of Monster energy drink before a race. Does this mean the globally enforced rules of one of the most powerful sporting regulatory bodies in the world are based more on vibes than hard evidence when it comes to weed? It didn't take long for this data point alone to start seeding the cracks in the WADA's logic here. So if the basis here isn't actually cutting-edge modern doping science, where does WADA's idea of the spirit of sport come from? Ancient Greek athletes were taking drugs that would probably send our modern runners and lifters to the hospital. Even the term doping is said to come from the Dutch word doop, a kind of gooey opium juice that the ancient Greeks couldn't get enough of. As much as organizations like to cast their nostalgic eyes back to purer eras where the spirit of sport reigned, the Olympics and contests like it were always commercial, even in the ancient world. There were huge cash prizes up for grabs back then. Nobody was leaving anything to chance, and a bounty of substances taken from both plants and animals were all on the table. The ancient Greek Dr. Galen documented that pro athletes took a variety of stimulants and other drugs to stay in top form. The winner of the sprint in 668 BC was on a dried fig diet to keep his energy boosted. It wasn't uncommon for athletes to also take a mushroom compound called ambrosia to keep their athletic edge. Some would eat only meat for days on end, if not resorting to wine potions and animal hearts. And it's worth noting that the ancient Greeks could actually be way more weird and underhanded in trying to get the edge over their competitors. Archaeologists have found evidence that athletes and their supporters literally tried to curse opposing athletes into losing. Lead curse tablets have been found in areas where the sports were practiced. But it wasn't just the ancient Greeks. In ancient China, 5,000 years ago, physicians were recommending a drug called ma huang, taken from the ephedra plant, to improve performance. The ancient Egyptians, one of the greatest civilizations in all human history, had a special tincture said to give their athletes an edge. Both Roman gladiators and medieval European knights also doped up with the natural tools available to them, using stimulants to keep on fighting longer. Viking berserkers were also said to take a hallucinogenic cocktail that helped them enter the berserker gang, a violent trance where they could cut down friend and foe alike. And all of this continued as late as the 1800s, when the names of the drugs started to get a lot more recognizable. To gain an edge in the competitive world of long-distance cycling, riders would indulge in heroin, cocaine, strychnine, and ether-soaked sugar cubes, a cocktail that would literally kill you if you got the doses even slightly wrong. But none of this was considered at all a breach of the rules. The idea of comparing Sha'Carri Richardson smoking a joint to emotionally regulate to people taking strychnine for a competitive edge feels laughable. So if the WADA spirit of sport isn't the echo of some perfect yesteryear where everyone was involved in sport for the pure love of the game, then when did the tables start to turn? And how did weed, a drug that's now legal in states across the US, become such a boogeyman? If you asked most people who started America's disastrous war on drugs, they'd probably tell you it was President Richard Nixon. But while Nixon put the plan into action, he wasn't the one who drew the blueprint. The dubious honor would go to Harry J. Anslinger, the original drug czar, and the greatest enemy of weed in American history. Anslinger was the first commissioner of the U.S. Federal Bureau of Narcotics, and he held the position for 32 years. He served under multiple presidents from Herbert Hoover through John F. Kennedy. One of his most interesting jobs took his authority to the American-controlled section of Berlin in the aftermath of World War II. At the time, narcotics were running rife after the collapse of the Nazi regime. According to journalist Norman Ohler in his book Tripped: Nazi Germany, the CIA, and the Dawn of the Psychedelic Age, America couldn't handle the job of policing Western Berlin's out-of-control drug problem. So Anslinger needed to turn to retired Gestapo agents who would police the drug trade under Hitler and re-implement a lot of the Nazi drug policy. Anslinger was a fan of the Nazi drug policy, which often used brutally harsh sentences for drug offenses as a pretense for locking up minorities, including Jewish people. Despite weed becoming his #1 target in his 32-year crusade against drugs, he wasn't always super gung-ho about it. Before becoming the head of the Federal Bureau of Narcotics, he said that the idea of weed making people dangerous and violent was, quote, an absurd fallacy. But like anything in life, if you want to find out the answers, you just need to follow the money. When Anslinger took over in 1930, prohibition was on its way out. It would officially be repealed in 1933, and in the joint spot for public enemy #1 was cocaine and heroin. But neither were a big enough problem to justify the kind of budget that Anslinger wanted for his department, so the solution was to lobby for a shift in the goalposts that would criminalize more drugs, give his agents more to do, and justify a bigger budget from Congress. This push led to the Marijuana Tax Act of 1937, along with a lot of scaremongering that smoking a few joints would basically turn you into a deranged serial killer. Anslinger said in an infamous radio address that America's youth were becoming, quote, slaves to this narcotic, continuing addiction until they deteriorate mentally, become insane, turn to violent crime and murder. The poster boy for Anslinger's anti-weed frenzy was an extremely troubled young man named Victor Licata. He became known as the Dream Slayer after murdering his entire family with an axe in 1933. Thanks to sensationalist tabloid reporting, a narrative quickly took hold that Licata had been addicted to marijuana and driven into a violent reefer madness state that led to his killing spree. The reality was, of course, that he was a very unwell man with a family history of mental illness. But Anslinger was never one to let the truth get in the way of his extremely effective propaganda. A moral panic being started by a horrific crime like this might remind you of the 2012 Miami cannibal incident. That is when Rudy Eugene snapped and attacked an elderly homeless man named Ronald Pompo before being shot dead by officers arriving at the scene. At the time, it was widely circulated in the media that the attack was motivated by Eugene partaking in the designer drug known as bath salts. It launched a wave of other rumors about the drug. In reality, the only drug in Eugene's system was a small trace of marijuana, but unlike Harry Anslinger, we don't think that had anything to do with the attack. Anslinger consulted 30 different scientists about whether marijuana was dangerous to the public. 29 said no. So naturally, Anslinger moved forward with the one who already agreed with his agenda. Another reason Anslinger hated weed so much was that he believed Black and Latino people were the primary market for it. He believed that Black people made jazz music, which Anslinger described as satanic, under the drug's influence. He also believed that weed promoted interracial mixing, which was another huge no-no for him. Even the popularization of the word marijuana actually comes from Anslinger's racism. Before the year 1900, people mostly referred to it as cannabis in the United States. However, Anslinger thought that using the Hispanic word would make it sound more foreign and frightening to the white middle class of the time. During one of his many incidents testifying the merits of his policies before Congress, he said, "I wish I could show you what a small marijuana cigarette can do to one of our degenerate Spanish-speaking residents." Then came Nixon, who launched the war on drugs in 1971. He designated weed a Schedule I drug while calling it not particularly dangerous behind closed doors. Such harsh penalties for possession and dealing of cannabis also had a political element. Felons were unable to vote. Nixon hoped to use those laws as a way of persecuting members of the counterculture hippie movement and Black people who were generally anti-Nixon. Remember, one of the clauses in WADA's Spirit of Sport list is respect for rules and laws. So it probably won't surprise you then to know that the American government's position on weed has dictated how global sporting bodies and anti-doping agencies look at it too. It's less about ethics and more about optics, and people like Sha'Carri Richardson suffer as a result. But what can weed actually do for athletes? Anyone pointing to a single compound as a wonder drug that solves every problem is usually selling something. In reality, every substance comes with trade-offs. Weed is no different. In sport, it sits in a messy middle ground with real potential benefits and real drawbacks. One of the biggest benefits that athletes swear by and scientific evidence broadly supports is cannabis as a painkiller. According to one study, 54.5% of collegiate athletes who smoked weed for sports purposes said that aiding in recovery after intense games and training sessions was their biggest motivation. Former Olympic triathlete and 2008 Ironman 70.3 world champion Joanna Zeiger spent her post-athletic career as a medical cannabis researcher. She specifically looked into the use of cannabis as a pain relief aid. Zeiger has real skin in the game because her career-ending bike crash also gave her chronic pain that needs intense management, and she wanted to see if weed held all the answers. Studies by researchers like Zeiger have found that cannabis doesn't fully reduce pain, but it does make the pain feel less unpleasant. Thus, it's easier to manage on a subjective level. In her own study into athletes who partake in weed, Zeiger got shockingly similar results, with 61% of the respondents saying they used the drug for pain relief. 68% of that 61% said it worked. And with weed's relatively minimal side effects, those are extremely encouraging figures. But the other major benefit of cannabis use for athletes is psychological. Ask any elite athlete and they'll tell you that half of the game, whether it's against others or the limits of your own body, is won or lost in your head. According to a study published in the Journal of Sports Medicine, the bottom line finding is that cannabis before exercise seems to increase positive mood and enjoyment during exercise. Much like cannabis won't make your pain disappear, it also won't make you a better runner, but it can help you get more out of running. Its effects vary widely depending on the dosage and intensity of use, but for many people, the anti-anxiety effects can take the edge off effort. It can make endurance feel more manageable, even when the physical demands stay exactly the same. But when it comes to how you'll perform on the track or the field, the New York Times headline puts it best: "Science doesn't support idea that marijuana aids athletes' performance." In terms of its short-term hit to max effort and coordination, and the long-term risks to lung health if smoked, it's clear weed isn't comparable to stimulants or steroids. So where does that leave us? Whether the governing bodies of the world like it or not, top athletes are increasingly getting into weed. According to their own anecdata, it is helping them play better. Matt Barnes, who won the NBA championship with the Golden State Warriors in 2017 and spent 14 seasons playing professional basketball, said, "All of my best games, I was medicated. It wasn't every single game, but in 15 years, it was a lot." Former defensive lineman Sean Smith, who played 9 seasons in the NFL, said, "I smoked 2 blunts before every game. Martellus Bennett, who retired from the NFL after 10 seasons, said, "There's time when your body just hurts so bad that you don't want to just be popping pills all the time. It starts to eat at your liver and kidneys and things like that. And a human made that. God made weed. If weed helps you hurt less and keeps you calm while your nerves could be eating you alive, is it really throwing anyone off their game? And if this is a form of performance enhancement, how long before we say that creatine shakes, cryotherapy, and massages are performance enhancement too? At a point, isn't it just a little better if organizations like WADA chilled out? So what really happens when you take cannabis? Check out What Happens to Your Body When Smoking Weed to get the real story, or watch this instead.